Hey everyone, I hope this video finds you well. It is currently storming up here in Canada, so I figured what better time to record a new video. This video is more on the Russian forest ranger from before. It came to my attention that there was more stories from him that I hadn't seen, so I'm going to read those off now. And there was some confusion in the last video where some people thought that I was claiming to be the forest ranger, and no, I'm just reading the stories. I'm not even close to Russian. I know it might seem trivial for some people, but some people do need like a little bit of an extra explanation, so I have no trouble putting it in here. Anyways, I hope you will pull up a stump with me again, and we can go over more of these pretty creepy stories if I'm being honest. And on a side note, I wish you could see my cat right now. She is the cutest thing. I'll see if I can get like a little recording of her purring. I don't know if you could hear that or not, but anyways, let's get into the video. Thank you for listening to this intro that's a minute long. I once saw a deer mother bite one of her fawns by the head and then start shaking it violently until its neck snapped. She then dropped to the ground and nudged it a couple of times, as if she didn't quite understand what she had just done. I didn't stay to observe because I was a bit freaked out. One time I found a dead deer lying next to a tree. The markings on the tree, coupled up with the markings on the deer's head, suggested that it rammed its head into the tree's trunk until it died. So I took a blood sample, and when I analyzed it, it was completely healthy. One time in the winter, I stumbled upon a fresh kill. It was a deer with half its face missing, and its neck was all screwed up. There was a huge hole in its abdomen with the guts hanging out. As I poked the wound in order to check the temperature, the thing lets out a yelp and rises to its feet, in complete disbelief as this bloody mess turns its head to look at me and starts walking away calmly. It collapses after about 10 meters and doesn't get back up after that. So those short ones just kind of show how weird deer can be sometimes. And these are stag, not like regular deer like we have in my area of Canada. But on a side note about the deer here, when I used to work at a store, I used to be the receiver, and the truck driver would tell me sometimes that the deer would see and hear him coming, but yet still run toward the truck and then pretty much headbutt the steel trailer and just die right on the spot. So it's just another story about how weird deer can be. Anyways, back into these. It can be pretty exhausting to relive these memories all the time, but I have another story for you. I've been seeing a girl for a couple of weeks. For some reason, she found my job to be hot and thought I was some sort of macho dude. I went along with it because she was also hot. She also hooked Peter up with one of her friends. She lived in one of the fancier houses in town with a nice view of the forest from her living room. We decided to have a double date at her house, where we would watch a movie and eat dinner. Of course, it didn't take long before Peter went to the guest room with his girl. I decided not to waste any time either and started sexy time as well. At this point, I admit I neglected my duties a bit. Peter and I hadn't been into the forest that entire month. We hadn't even responded to any calls regarding sick animals or possible poachers. We had been just gotten caught up in our own personal lives. It honestly felt nice to get a break from work, seeing as how we weren't exactly ever off duty. We fell asleep on the couch in the living room. At some point during the night I woke up. It was a beautiful starry night. I walked up to the glass door leading to the terrace in order to get a better view of the sky. After a few minutes I spot something in the distance, the faint glow of eye shine from something staring intensely at me. I froze in place and observed this unknown creature as it slowly started walking toward me. When it got within the light emanating from the house, it revealed itself to be a medium-sized red stag. It just kept walking towards me, didn't blink or take its eyes off me. It walked directly into the glass, which seemed to puzzle it a little bit. It started nudging the glass, which turned into a violent pushing. At this point I started backing away, still in complete disbelief at what was transpiring in front of me. My girlfriend wakes up due to the loud banging on the glass. "WTF is going on?" she asked, still half asleep. Before I can answer her, the stag starts letting out these guttural screams. As it intensifies its ramming, it breaks through the glass. My girlfriend screams, and Peter comes running down the stairs to see what's going on. The stag just calmly walks up to me like it hasn't just broken through a glass door. Keeps letting out those horrible noises as it approaches me. I tried backing up, but stepped in some glass and fell over on my ass. The stag just observed me with unflinching eyes as it kept bellowing. My girlfriend was still screaming. I'm suddenly deafened by the sound of Peter unloading his small sidearm. Hit the stag multiple times, but mainly missed, leading to a lot of property damage. The stag falls on the floor with a wet thud. To this day, I'm still grateful to Peter for bringing his gun. The girlfriend and I broke up the next day. She said that I was either cursed or unlucky. Either way, she didn't want anything to do with me. I still always sleep with my blinds on. I never want to see another window into the night, especially when I know what might be on the other side of that glass. I may have ignored the forest, but it certainly didn't ignore me. I once found myself lost with Peter in a snowstorm. We were basically as effed as we could ever be, with no shelter or any way to start a fire. Snow was falling so densely that we couldn't even see more than 5 meters in front of us. The wind was so cold that my lips started bleeding. We drove around for what felt like an eternity until we came up on this old, decrepit hunting cabin. We had difficulty dismounting our ATVs because our clothes were frozen solid just on our backs. I still remember how Peter was shaking and clacking his teeth. The cabin was completely empty, but had a simple fireplace and some semi-dry wood. As we sat there slowly warming up by the fire, we had a moment of absolute dread when we realized that we might actually effing die here. We had no idea how long the storm would last, and there wasn't a whole lot of wood for us to burn. Peter then rose to his feet and muttered, "Eff it, wait here." He went outside and returned a few minutes later with an axe. For a brief second I legitimately wondered if he was going to put me out of my misery. To my relief, he started beating the ever-loving shit out of the floorboards. Use this as firewood. It should keep the fire going for a while longer. Bless you, Peter, and your demented brain. In the end, we probably burned about half the cabin's floor, which revealed more and more of the cold dirt underneath. And of effing course, there happened to be the remains of a couple of people down there. We were waiting out in the storm, stuck in the effing murder cabin. The remains looked very old, fortunately, just dusty skeletal remains. Seriously debated on whether we should leave or stay. So we decided to stay, because we'd have a better chance of survival against a psycho Russian killer than the storm. At one point, I swear we heard someone approaching the cabin, only to run away into the wilderness. It makes no sense because only a mentally deranged person would have the balls to wander out around there at that time. Then again, we were in a cabin with corpses under the floorboards. We sat with our rifles ready just in case. After a long while, the storm started winding down. We emerged from the cabin, dug our ATVs out of the snow, and made our way back into town. Navigating was a lot easier now that we could actually see where we were going. Immediately went to the police station after this. They were surprised to see us since they had already reported us missing or dead. We told them about the cabin and agreed to show them the next day. I slept for about 14 hours after soaking in a tub of hot water. Best sleep I've ever had in my life. We met up with the officers and led them through the forest to the cabin. It was effing gone. There was no trace to be found of it whatsoever. The trails left behind by our ATVs were still very clearly there, even the spot where we dug them out, but the cabin itself just wasn't there. There was a clear area where it had been, but there was nothing but a fresh layer of snow. The officers looked irritated and said that we were wasting their time. They said that we must have been hallucinating, or that we drank too much of Peter's homebrew. It still makes no sense to me, and we never found an explanation for that. Peter and I had been on one of our excursions in early fall when we came across a panicked hunter. He begged us to help his friend who had been attacked by a bear further up the trail. He drove with us up to the incident that had occurred, but it was already too late. His friend was effed up beyond belief. His face was ripped off, he was gutted, limbs bending in unnatural positions. Almost threw up on the spot. We decided that this bear was too dangerous to be left alive, since it was roaming fairly close to town. We started looking for tracks to get an idea of where it was headed. The hunter was just sitting up against a tree, too shocked to react to what was actually going on. We kept describing the creature as a bear when we asked him. The thing is, we only found deer tracks at the scene. Against our better judgment, we started tracking them. I swear there was a constant stream of cold sweat running down my back while we hunted this nasty MFer. Would honestly have rather been actually tracking a bear at this point. We reached a clearing at some point where we found a piece of the guy's face hanging from a bush. We were shitting enough bricks to build a new Berlin Wall at this point, but we trekked on. Finally, we caught sight of the effer. It wandered aimlessly around in circles, almost like its internal compass was screwing up. This time, I was the one who shot it, and I couldn't let Peter have all the fun. Hit it right in the head, instant death. Chunks of flesh were still hanging from its antlers. Had to actually collect the individual pieces and put them in a plastic bag so we could deliver them to the morgue with the rest of the body. We gagged as we did it. It was so horrible. Ended up driving the shocked hunter back with us so he could deliver his testimony. "Why did you tell us it was a bear?" Peter asked him. "You would have never believed me," he answered. "If only you knew." Peter and I were hanging outside his apartment one night, sharing stories and drinking. We sat out on his small balcony and smoked when we got a call from the police station. There had been a strange sightings of an animal, presumably a bear, roaming the area. Some locals were pretty spooked and had reported it to the police. Of course, it fell under our jurisdiction. We decided that we would just check it out in the morning. We didn't feel like chasing some large, unidentified creature while half drunk and the sun had just gone down. Sit for a few more minutes just chatting when a deafening screech echoed from beyond the tree line. We were silent for a couple of minutes. "F me, that was loud," Peter said. Really, no really. We decided to check it out. Operation Half-Drunk Russians Packing Heat commenced. We wandered around aimlessly, randomly pointing our flashlights and rifles around in the dark. "You have got to be effing kidding me," Peter shouted. He had found cloven footprints. "Don't tell me this is another effing deer, I swear to God." He sounded both angry and scared, rustling behind us. We both instantly turned and aimed at the sound. Two glowing eyes reflect our flashlights. It lets out a loud squeal and charges at us. We both lighted up while we simultaneously mess our pants. It's a boar. An effing boar. It was so big that we initially thought it was a bear. "At least it wasn't an effing deer," I said. Peter let out a nervous laugh and shook his head in awe of the effing beast lying before us. Honestly, we didn't know what to do with it. We hadn't brought our ATVs and the thing was too heavy to carry, so we decided to just leave it. The wolves can scavenge it. The police actually believed us this time. Some of the hogs out there can grow to enormous sizes, and you're lucky it didn't get you. Another thing to worry about. Great. Most people don't know this, but there are loads of unmapped and unexplored cave systems all around Russia. This is also the case from where I lived. It wasn't uncommon for Peter and I to stumble upon a cave or two while we were on our excursions. Lots of local legends surround the caves, like an underground city of subterranean people, covens of witches, prehistoric animals, and so on. Whatever the case, I always found cave systems to be fascinating. It's like entering a new world where the same rules don't really apply. So when the police mounted a rescue team to help a teenager who had gotten trapped in one of the caves, I didn't hesitate to volunteer. At this point, Peter and I were liked enough by the police. They kind of trusted us and included us in some of their work. Peter didn't come along this time because he was too hungover. As the case stood, two teenage boys to try to explore a local cave system that had some very steep drop-offs. One of the boys had lost his footing and tumbled down into the darkness. He was alive, but had broken his ankle and couldn't get out. Rather than getting stuck himself, his friend had just chosen to send for help. We made our way through the cave, making sure to watch our step. The cave floor was damp and covered with algae, so it wasn't that much of a surprise that the boy had slipped. When we came to the drop-off, we shone our lights down at him. He waved and smiled, knowing he was saved. I started descending the steep rock wall with a rope tied around my waist. When I reached the bottom, I secured the boy to the rope and gave the officers the signal to start pulling him up. "He went that way," the boy said to me, and pointed in a narrow passageway at the back of the cave. "Excuse me?" I asked, wondering if he had hit his head on the way down. "My friend, he came back for me, and he told me that he found an exit that way." I was confused, but told him, "Your friend is up there with the others." His face went completely pale on the spot. "But he was down here with me. He went that way." An uneasy feeling hit me, which I tried to ignore. Now I was stuck at the bottom of a small chasm until I threw down the rope again, and this kid claims that somebody was down here with him, even though his friend had gone straight to the police. I felt very exposed and kept focusing on the narrow passage at the back of the cave. I point my flashlight to the ground and find effing footprints leading to the passage, bare feet. Just as I am unloading the contents of my stomach into my shorts, they throw down the end of the rope and hit me right on the shoulder. I let out a shriek of horror that those bastards never let me live down. As they pulled me up, I refused to look back down. I got the F out of there as soon as possible. Whatever was down there, I don't want to know. One of our biggest problems with poachers was that they would sometimes leave behind these heavy-duty rusty bear traps. Sometimes they never came back for them, which meant that some parts of the forest could potentially be a minefield for broken ankles. Sometimes we'd find rotting carcasses that had become trapped in one and left to die. I almost stepped in one once, but Peter noticed the chain in time to stop me. "Thanks again, buddy." One time we came across one of these traps which had been sprung. Left in the trap was a boot, with the foot still attached. The rest of the body was gone. A large pool of blood was left behind, with bloody pieces of fabric. From what we could see, it looked like someone had gotten stuck and then had his foot amputated. We followed the bloody trail but found no body. I must have been with a friend who drove him out of here. The ironic part is that bear traps are fairly easy to break out of if you know which pin to pull. The poor guy lost his foot because of some dumbass poacher. Took the foot with us and asked around the police station. They hadn't had any reports of people getting effed by bear traps. The guy didn't even go to a hospital. This meant he had either been a poacher himself or just one tough son of a bitch. Never found him or heard of anything of him since then. Still, finding a severed foot in the forest is never nice, especially when you know the type of stuff that's out here. Peter once showed me an abandoned settlement that he found back in the day. Even though we were roughly the same age, I was more of a city boy than him. He had always lived out in the less populated areas and spent a lot of his childhood and teenage years on exploring the forest. He really talked about his childhood, mainly because of his alcoholic father who beat him and his mother. But he trusted me and sometimes opened up after a bottle or two. To him, exploring the wilderness was a way to escape from his dysfunctional home, which is why he had a pretty good internal map of the place. We drove for a couple of hours until we arrived at the settlement. It looked all rotten and old as hell. Most of the buildings were made out of wood and looked ready to collapse at any second. Some were your typical Soviet concrete that looked about as stable as our economy. Still, we chose to explore a bit just in case. After all, this place would have made an amazing base for poachers. The houses were empty except for some damp furniture and a couple of stoves. The concrete structures, on the other hand, still had some interesting stuff lying around. We found some wet boxes of old dynamite, which led us to believe that this was an old mining town. Sure enough, there was a large quarry a few kilometers away, which we found later. A lot of stuff that we found was too rusted to make out what it had once been. Everything else was just in a state of decay that made it seem pretty unsafe for us to fool around with it too much. It's not uncommon to find old abandoned mining towns that were never put on the map, so we didn't really take a second to wonder why they had been abandoned. That is, until we spotted the deer. Peter anxiously nudged my shoulder and gestured to the right of us. There was a large stag watching us from behind one of the houses. The more we looked around, the more deer we noticed. There were maybe 10 or 12 of them just observing us. They didn't seem threatened by us, but rather like they were making sure that we were on our way out of there. We slowly approached our ATVs as these efforts just followed us silently, never blinking or making a sound. When we got to our ATVs, we debated whether or not we should just light them up, but we decided against it, because we didn't want a herd of bloodthirsty demon deer charging us. We just started driving away, counting ourselves lucky, seeing as how they hadn't decided to F us up. I remember looking back once we were about 100 meters or so away and seeing well over 20 deer standing there, motionless. Peter shouted "F that" as we raced out of the area and back to town. We never went back, but often talked about it. He firmly believed that the deer had something to do with the settlement being abandoned. I'm not so sure about that, but I definitely don't think it's out of the question. These deer and their mysterious ways. At this point, the police knew of our various encounters, but they didn't really believe us. But they still had enough respect for us not to mock us. After all, we had retrieved quite a few bodies for them that had been effed to high hell by deer. That all changed when one of the officers, one of my friends, went missing. He had responded to a call about some kids that had claimed to have been stalked by a strange old man while they played in the forest. For some reason, he had gone out there alone to investigate. That was 16 hours ago, and nobody had heard from him since. Peter and I helped with the search, since we both knew him quite well. Hours of searching yielded nothing. Then, someone found his handgun lying on the ground. It had been fired twice, but we couldn't find the bullet casings. One of the officers had brought a search dog. It took a few whiffs of the gun and started darting off into the woods, obviously tracing something. We followed as best as we could, but the damn thing was fast as hell. Suddenly the woods were filled with the sound of aggressive barking and whining. We arrived at the spot where the dog had gone and found, big surprise, a big effing deer. From one of its antlers hung the lifeless body of the officer. It had impaled him through his throat and out the mouth. It was so grotesque that I still get a lump in my throat when I think about it. It was my friend, and that effing deer had killed him. It stood completely still, its head weighed down by the officer. The dog whimpered and snarled at it, but it didn't move an inch closer to it. One of the officers shot at it, which caused us all to just light it up. Retrieving his body still stands clear in my mind as one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. After that incident, the officers always took our claims seriously. They even offered backup when we went on our excursions. I still wonder about the old man, though. Did the kids just imagine him? Peter still insisted that something supernatural was manipulating the deer, making them aggressive and batshit insane. I still leaned more towards the theory that deer are just, by their very nature, batshit insane. At one point, we were checking out a potential poaching camp. When we arrived, we were greeted by two older men who immediately started questioning us. We explained the situation to them and asked them to step outside so we could inspect their camp. It was a pretty standard camp with some fresh kills and pelts, but the men seemed really nervous anyway, like they were hiding something. We started questioning them until they cracked. They admitted that they had just shot and killed about 7 or 8 deer the previous night, but they hadn't retrieved a single one of the carcasses, and they had simply fled the area. What kind of hunter kills animals just to let them rot, huh? Why the F did you do it? Peter asked them, with a sense of urgency in his voice. They explained that they had been sitting in the deer blind, waiting to take a decent shot at some unlucky deer. Then they spotted one that walked straight at them, and when they aimed at it, they saw its eyes through their scopes. It was just looking directly at them, but just still walked calmly toward them. That's when they heard a twig snap and realized that their blind was being surrounded. All of them had the same lifeless look in their eyes. None of them made a noise or any sudden movements. And when they had just completely surrounded the blind, they started pulling some aggressive expressions and began billowing at the hunters. Their blind was raised about 3 meters off the ground and supported by 4 wooden pillars. The deer started ramming the supports while they were kept bellowing. The hunters were scared shitless and just started shooting the deer one by one. They ran back to their camp after that and hadn't even been on hunting since then. They showed us the way to their blind, and sure enough, there were several deer carcasses lying at the base of it. There were visible markings on the supports which backed up their claim. Then they asked us if they were going to get in trouble for what they had done. We told them no, as long as they didn't do anything with the carcasses, we wouldn't press charges. Normally we would have made them pay a fee, quotes, seeing as they had been through the encounter with psycho deer. We sympathized with them. In fact, we thanked them for taking care of them for us, since they were a threat to the locals. We told them that if they ever encountered aggressive deer, they should put them down immediately. They looked a bit puzzled as we drove away. Never saw them again. Now this incident is what the possible forest ranger claims is what led him to leave Russia entirely and move to Western Europe. It all started when Peter got a terrible idea. He suggested that we found a central point in the forest, perhaps near a lake, anywhere a deer were known to frequent. Then we would set up a blind in one of the biggest trees there and camp out for a week or so, shooting any deer that seemed off. At first I just called him a dumbass, seeing as our job was to preserve the wildlife rather than mow it down. To be honest, I was also terrified of the thought of spending an entire week in the middle of nowhere. He called me a pussy and gave me an ultimatum: either you go up with me or I go out alone. I wasn't about to let my best friend go out there all by himself for a week. He probably knew that and used that as bait. We drove to the local hardware store and picked up the necessary equipment for our little project: screws, wooden planks, rope, etc., etc. We went shopping for other supplies such as canned food and water, loaded our ATVs with all of our gear, and set out to the wilderness. I wondered why Peter suddenly wanted us to do something so rash and stupid, but figured that he had just had enough, and I didn't really blame him, to be honest. The weird thing was, though, that we had actually not experienced anything unnatural for almost half a year up to this point. Part of me wondered if he actually wanted to seek it out for some reason. He never told me why he decided to lead this dumb crusade against the deer, but I still went with him so that I could watch his back. We eventually found a pretty large lake surrounded by big beautiful trees. It was early August, so we weren't in any danger of freezing to death, while we slept anyways. We started building our blind, which ended up being more of a wooden platform, 5 or 6 meters above the ground with a great view of the lake. By the time we were finished, the sun was setting, and we had seen no sign of wildlife the entire time while we built our blind, but figured it was just due to the amount of noise we made. Our plan had one huge flaw that we had forgot to realize: effing mosquitoes. We had no cover, and were placed right next to the goddamn mosquito capital of effing Russia. We caught no sight of anything strange the first night except each other's swollen faces. At dawn the next day, we awoke to the sound of something splashing around in the water. We peeked over the edge of our blind and saw a doe, along with her 2 fawns. We observed them for about 15 minutes before we determined that they were pretty normal. Similar incidents happened every once in a while the first couple of days, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. I felt relieved and wondered if they had migrated to some new place, planning on terrorizing some new rangers. But for some reason, Peter seemed extremely tense and would curse under his breath. "Hey, Peter? What's going on, man?" He looked at me with a hollow expression and sat up beside me. He explained that he had been having nightmares about the deer. He felt that if he killed some of them, he could prove to himself that he had nothing to fear. The poor guy hadn't had a decent night's sleep in well over a month at that point. He almost started crying while he told me these things, which really showed me how close this guy was to the edge. I had to help him, so I stayed with him and kept a lookout while he took a nap. I hadn't told him anything, but I'd actually been looking into how much it would cost to move away from Russia. I hadn't seen anything because I wasn't really planning on anything. Besides, I didn't feel like I could just leave him behind. I kept an eye out on our surroundings for several hours and almost decided to just lay back and enjoy the view of the lake when I heard something approaching to our left. Out of the tree line stepped a lone stag. I waited a bit to see if it would behave strangely before I woke Peter up. It bowed its head and motioned as if it had started drinking from the lake, even though it wasn't anywhere near the lake shore. That was more than enough proof for me, and I slowly shook Peter until he woke up. He instantly crawled over to the edge, and looked at the deer, grinning with some kind of sadistic satisfaction. He aimed at it with his rifle and fired, a direct hit, straight to the chest. He let out a sigh of relief and started laughing. We heard the sound of several animals walking around within the tree line, but never saw any of them. It almost sounded like that the lone stag had been bait to see how we would react. This only fueled Peter's paranoia. He was practically trembling with fear every time we heard something wander around in the tree line. Sometimes the deer would appear on our far side of the lake, but no matter how many times Peter and I shot at it, we never hit it. At night, our main source of light was a lantern that ran on petroleum. Part of me always suspected that this was a horrible idea, to use that in a blind made of dry wood. Our 5th night into the crusade, shit hit the fan. We kept spotting the eyeshine of several animals, but every time we looked through the scopes there was nothing. It felt like they were toying with us. Peter started firing shots into the air, trying to deter the creepy efforts from whatever they were doing, but of course it didn't work. I picked up a lantern and raised it higher in order to illuminate the ground better. When I stand up, I get lightheaded and fall over. I drop the lantern, which in turn starts a goddamn inferno. We abandon everything and just descend down to our rope. My rifle was up there along with all of my favorite gear. As we stood there in the night, the blazing blind illuminated a lot more than the lantern had. I still shudder at the thought. The largest flock of deer I had ever seen were standing in the tree line. All of their eyes were lit up from the flames, giving them a hellish appearance. Peter is practically hyperventilating at this point and makes a dash toward our ATVs. We hit the ignition and get the F out of there. We never looked back to see if they followed or anything. The entire ride back, we just kept driving and letting out cries of adrenaline mixed with actual terror. When we got back, Peter just went home without saying a word. I went to my apartment and completely shut myself off from the rest of the world. Locked my door, closed the blinds, and turned off my shitty phone. I stayed that way for a couple of days. Then I got the sudden urge to get a drink. I had already consumed every bottle of alcohol in my apartment, so I went to a bar that was located on my street. When I entered, I was met with worried looks from the people who knew me. "How you doing?" the bartender asked me with a sympathetic tone. This surprised me because none of them would have known about the stuff Peter and I went through the past week. Could have been better. Why? Well, after Peter's accident, you just kind of disappeared for a while. Peter's accident? What happened while I was in my apartment? My expression made the situation pretty clear. "Oh shit, man, I thought you knew." And he filled me in. Peter had packed his bags and rented some rundown car with the intention of skipping town. He had then taken off in a heavily intoxicated state and hit a tree at 120 kilometers an hour. The car was totaled and Peter died on the spot. After a few minutes of silence, I remember standing up and just walking out of there. I walked around aimlessly for hours, trying to make sense of what happened. Eventually I found myself back at my apartment complex. I noticed a piece of paper hanging on my mailbox. I began tearing up when I read it. "My dear friend, I've decided to leave this place. I can no longer bear the shadow that looms over us, and I hope you will come visit me someday. You helped me through some bad times, because this time you can't help me. If you decide to come over, you can find me at," and then the address, but it's blacked out. I cried for so long that it seemed like an eternity. I still tear up as I'm typing this. After about a month or so, I decided to move out of Russia and get a fresh start. I know I can never escape my past, or the nightmares that keep resurfacing, but I put a great distance between then and now. I still miss that crazy bastard every day, and I will never forget what an amazing friend he was. I now live in the safety of the heart of a big city, far away from any forest. I sometimes go on drives through some of the more scenic woods, but it feels so fake. European forests don't have the same raw feeling as the Russian forests. I sometimes miss my old home. I just wish there wasn't an abundance of terrifying animals roaming the woods. I haven't experienced anything unnatural since I moved, and I finally learned to sleep properly at night. I regularly speak to a psychiatrist about some of my experiences and feel more in control of my fears now. Well, that's it. Believe it if you will. Either way, this is very real to me, and next time you get the chance, please raise a glass to Peter. Honor his memory and the man he was. So I hope you enjoyed going on this journey with me. And I hope you enjoyed the video. These have been the stories of the Russian forest ranger that I've been reading. And if you liked the video, then please like and subscribe for more videos like this, because I frequently post stories that I find on the internet, I will put a Patreon link in the description. If you feel like you want to donate, there's no obligation to do so. Everything still is free. The only thing I can give anybody right now is their name in the credits. So, yeah. I hope this video found you well, and I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good night, and thank you for watching.